we are going to discuss about the non-agrarian economic scenario during the Delhi Sultanate. Now, we are just not going to talk about North India, but we are also going to see what was the situation from 13th century, let's say second half of 13th century to early 16th century. So this is going to be our area of discussion. First of all, we have to see as to how historians have evaluated this period as the economy of this period. Now, earlier, there was this trend among the historians to see Delhi Sultanate as a time when huge population was massacred. So they were of the opinion that yes, they did bring a kind of economic change, but since the material and human resources were destroyed, so it was a change that actually was negative. Now, this whole logic was based on European historians like Eliot, and based on this argument, you have Lalanji Gopal, who said that it was the Muslims or the advent of the Muslims for which India became very poor. So the poverty of India actually was because of the advent of the Muslims. Now, K.S. Lal even went further. He said that one-third of the population of India was reduced. Now, these arguments changed in 1950 with Muhammad Habib, who tried to look into the history, formatively the economic history of this period, with evidence. Now, what Muhammad Habib concluded is that the economy of this period was definitely superior to the one it usurped. So, what he tried to say is that during this time, urbanization took place, so new urban centers grew and the existing urban centers expanded. This is number one that he said. Secondly, he said the agrarian relationship changed, and this produced more and more surplus, and the ruling class or the ruling elite who used this surplus did not have the caste bias, so they consumed articles produced by artisans of any caste. So this gave a kind of inter-professional mobility in the towns. Now this altogether what he wanted to say is that it was a kind of an urban revolution. But Irfan Habib, he said that these observations made by Muhammad Habib was important, but he refused to call this a revolution in the modern sociological term. So, but of course, he said that it is true that we have to look into the economic changes, and especially the non-agrarian economic changes, with evidence. Now, after much research, it is evident that three aspects or three interrelated things, economic change took place. First of all, urbanization. Towns grew in number and expanded. Secondly, craft production increased. And third, commerce expanded. Now, first we have to discuss what we know about urban development or urbanization. Now, from archaeological evidences, we find that Delhi and the adjoining areas, like what we today know as Siri area, the Tughlaqabad, Firozabad, the Qutub area, all this, if you look into the archaeological excavations, it gives proof of large habitat. So therefore, one can say that there was definite urban expansion. Now, we also hear about, from the sources, the contemporary sources, we hear about Lahore, we know about Anhilwara or Patan, as you know. Then we know about Lakhnawati, Cambay. All these were very, very important urban centers. Now we have to see as to what was happening in these urban centers. Now, urban centers is always flocked by artisans. Now, these artisans were using technology now which was very different. Remember, a huge population came from West. that is West Asia and Central Asia, when Delhi Sultanate was formed. Now, what are the kind of technological changes that was taking place? Because technological changes brings about change in the industrial production, that what gives an impetus to non-agrarian production. Now, first of all, you know that India's cotton textile production has always been very important. Now, we have to see what are the technological changes that appeared in cotton textile production. Now, first we have to talk about the spinning wheel, or as we know as charkha. Now, the spinning wheel definitely came from West. Of course, we hear about Persian wheel, a charkha being used in the 12th century Persian vases. Now, in China, it was used definitely before 12th century. So, spinning wheel came from China, it went to Central Asia, moved to Persia, and then came into India. Now, Futuh Salatin of Isami talks about the spinning wheel, and he also says that women should use this spinning wheel. Now, this proves that yarn, the demand of yarn, cotton yarn, became very important for production, so much so that it has to be produced in the domestic area also. So women has to use that. India had the history of loom, but the use of loom was diversified with the use of treadle. Now, with the use of treadle, what we see is the production increased. Sanskrit lexicons do talk about loom, but they do not mention treadle, that's for sure.
But then, ma'am, then how do we come to know about the spinning wheel and the treadle?
We have references in the 14th century sources. Treadles are mentioned definitely in the Mughal sources, but of course we can understand that if spinning wheel came to India in the 14th century, definitely treadle will also come. Because the idea that we have about the production, that amount of production could not have happened if the treadle did not arrive to India. So that you have to keep in mind. Okay. So next we move on to sericulture. Now, silkworm production also started in the 14th century. We have definite proof of it in Bengal in the 14th century. We have in the mid-16th century, we hear of it in Kashmir. Now, what happened was, since silk threads being produced in India, now the cost of it will lower, and that again will give an impetus to export. Now, let us come to the other technological changes that took place. Now, the use of paper. Now, China used paper in the 10th century, but we hear of 14th century sources of Gujarat, where we know that paper was definitely produced here. What would be the impact of paper production on, let's say, the life of India, common man?
Ma'am, literacy would increase.
Yes, the use of book. Books were illustrated, books were written on these papers. So books became more and more available to common man. Now, another industry which flourished, especially in areas of Kashmir, is the carpet making. Now, vertical loom definitely was introduced in this time. But of course, the use of vertical loom, the evidence of the use happens to be in the Mughal sources. What vertical loom did to carpet weaving is that more and more designs could be introduced here, and the production fastened. So, now carpet production became one of the areas where it could be exported. Let us now move on to other kind of industries.
Ma'am, did these technological changes affect adversely the common man?
It did not. It was employment generation. Common man got work here. The artisan class was used to one kind of a technology. Now, when the artisans from West came in, so they came in with new technologies. The existing technologies were improvised. So now you have a technological exchange, and a betterment of it. So obviously that made the use of paper. Common man used paper. More and more cotton textile was used by common man at a cheaper rate. These are the things definitely affected common man.
So ma'am, was paper industry an important one?
Definitely. I mean, it changed the whole literacy scenario of India. Book illustrations, for which you know that medieval India is so popular, happened because it produced very good quality paper. We now move on to let's see how zinc distillation helped. Zinc distillation, again, the technology of it was first heard in China. It came from there via Persia into India. Now, zinc is a very important important metal for brass. And brass, produced very fine utensils for which India became very popular. So this again is another area. Now you can see that this brass metal, brass utensils could be now used by common man. I mean, common household, the use of common household utensil changed. The face or standard of life, changed with the use of utensils. We were talking about urbanization. What strikes most in town? I mean, how do you recognize town? With its building? Now, we also associate, the advent of Islam and architecture. Now, what we see is there was a huge technological changes that we see during this time. Now, the use of lime mortar as cement for cementing. Then you have vaulted roofs. Then you have the use of true arch. Now, all these changed the concept of architecture in India. You have this massive bricks, the use of rubble in between stones. What we see from archaeological evidences is that the common man's dwelling, I mean the middle class dwelling, changed from wooden thatched roof to something different. So this definitely changed the scenario of building. And you can understand that a number of people were employed in this industry. You can understand that all these technological changes brought about a kind of a change in the industrial area. Now, we have to talk about merchants now. Did the merchants change? Now, who are the merchants? The businessmen. Now, monetization definitely increased, the use of money. We know that Delhi Sultanate produced fine, standardized gold and silver coins. We know about 13th, 14th century silver coins, especially the coins that were issued by Alauddin Khalji. They were very fine standardized coins. Reserve gold and silver was transformed into coins. So you can understand how money, the use of money changed in urban area and in the rural area. So much so that merchants now used to give loans against draft. Now, we know about a source which says that Alauddin Khalji paid 20,000 tankas for buying materials. He gave it to the merchants. You can very well understand that, therefore, money had a very important role to play in this change. Now, let us come to see that who gave this labor. Now, we talked about the skilled artisans who came from outside. The indigenous artisans, they adapted themselves to the technology, true. But not only master, you just don't have to have master artisans. You need cheap labor for industry. Where did the cheap labor come from? Now, you know about the initial wars. The war captives were transformed into slaves. Among the war captives, you had skilled and unskilled labor. During this period, even the poorest of the poor in the urban areas had slaves. Ziauddin Barni gives an idea about the slave market of Delhi. Now he says that one male slave would cost less than an inferior horse. So it was so cheap. Alauddin Khalji gave special instructions to Malik Kafur during his southern expedition. He asked more and more captives should be brought to Delhi as slaves. 20,000 war captives were transferred to slaves in Gujarat. Now, in Kalinjar, you have around 50,000 slaves. We also know about Balban a few years earlier, where he, during his Ranthambore campaign, he captured around 30,000 slaves. Now, all these slaves worked in the royal industries. So you can understand that how cheap labor was. But this scenario did not remain long. Wars became fewer, so much so that Firoz Tughlaq had to issue an order by which he said that no slaves will be exported outside Delhi.
Excuse me, ma'am, what happened to the skilled laborers at that time?
It is very interesting. I can give you one reference of a mystic named Nur Turk in the 14th century. He was a very humble, poor man who had a skilled slave and who used to work on loom. So he used to earn for his masters. So commercial artisans used slaves for commercial purposes. Slaves were used for domestic work, as well as non-commercial masters used slaves for commercial purposes. So they brought money for the masters. So this is another area that we have to keep in mind. This scenario did not remain for long. What Irfan Habib has said is that this is a transitional phenomena. Now, after few generations, you can understand that these slaves, they were freed. Slave labor is without any incentive, so you don't get profit much out of it. Now, if you look into the account of Babur, he talks about artisans in India, but he does not give any idea about slaves. So therefore, he did not notice much of slavery in labor. So this is roughly the scenario of labor. Artisans, caste-based artisans, they adjusted themselves. New subcastes were formed. But you have to keep in mind the rigid caste system of India, which did not give much space to social mobility, of course. Now, let us move to see what was happening beyond the Vindhyas, that is South India. Now, from 14th century to mid-16th century, you can say that most of the southern India was unified under the Vijayanagar Empire. For the Vijayanagar emperors, Delhi Sultanate was the role model. The use of monetization, more and more revenue that they wanted, that they exploited from the peasants, and also the Nayankara system is very much close to what you have in Delhi Sultanate's Ikta system. Initially, if you want to have good flow of revenue, you have to appoint people into different areas to assure that revenue. So Nayankara system was almost like the Ikta system. South India always had this tradition of commercial life. Now what happened during the period of discussion is that the magnitude changed. It expanded. Let's talk about the role of the state in this business. There are two areas in which the state played role. Now they traded in horses. Now who supplied the horses? The foreigners, the foreign merchants. Now they could not monopolize that. What instead they monopolized is the distribution of these horses among the local magnates, by which they remained very important among the feudatories. So horses, and they even demanded money for the dead horses. So much so. They had so much of control over the trade. Another thing which gave an edge to the Vijayanagar Empire was the use of firearm. Firearm also was monopolized by the Vijayanagar state. Now let us move into the other aspect of the states.
Ma'am, we get to hear a lot about castes and temples in South India. So what role did it actually have to play?
Well, it's very interesting that caste and temples, like we do not have the role of temples to play anywhere in North India. We do not mention anything like this. But temples did have a commercial role to play. Now, from 14th to 16th century, if we look, we hear about 80 commercial centers, of which many were temple centers. A temple controlled the adjoining commerce of the time. Now, some of the traders also lived in these temple cities. Now, they operated from their residences. They gave rents to the temple. So, the temples survived because of this. Now, in the time of war, or let's say some kind of dislocation, now it was the merchants who contributed to the temple fund. So there was a kind of a liaison with the temple and the merchants as such. So we also know about the cities, where traders lived on the basis of their profession in different areas, and those profession depended on the caste they had. So caste had a major role to play. So it is very difficult, we do not have much interprofessional mobility in South India that we know about in North India. Even North India there was, but compared to South, it was more. It was much less in South India. Now, during Vijayanagar Empire, a number of foreign travelers came. Now, like we get an idea about the horse trade, let's say from Yunus. Yunus himself was a trader. Then we hear about Domenico Pius, who talked about the Vijayanagar wealth, the wealth of the court. Now, from the list that he gives, we know that those items were supplied, let's say, from China and even as far west as Mecca. So, Vijayanagar city, remember, is a very interior city. So even those interior cities could be supplied with goods from both the coasts, the east coast as well as the west coast. Now, another thing which is remarkable about the Vijayanagar Empire was its transport system. All the foreign travelers appreciated this. Another thing which is different from North India was these fairs. Now, the fairs were organized by temples or the local magnates. Now, there could be two very big fairs at the same time, and they were connected with the roads. Now, these fairs were just not religious affairs. These were also places where commercial activity took place, exchange took place. Now, and definitely money played a very important role here. We hear about early 15th century South Arcot inscription where peasants rebelled against the rulers because they were asked to pay revenue in money. So it was a kind of a burden for the peasants to pay so much in cash. They wanted to pay in grain. But because the commercial activity diversified, the state was involved in this commercial activity. They demanded the revenue in cash. So monetization, it changed the face of the commercial activities in South India. Now, Irfan Habib here talks about external trade, which according to him, is the most important aspect of the commercial activity during this period. He talks about pepper. Now, you know that pepper is a product which is produced in the Malabar coast. Now, this Malabar coast, of course, then included Kerala and Karnataka, both. Now, it was because of this pepper that, say, ships or the Chinese junk came to this area. Now, you have this celebrated Admiral Zheng He, who came over 30 years to this place. Now, we hear about the Persian ships coming here, the Arabian ships coming here, all for this pepper. Again, remember, it was because of pepper that Vasco da Gama came to India. Came halted in Calicut in 1498. Now, the advent of Vasco da Gama initiated the colonization of East. Initially, what the Portuguese did was they monopolized the trade in Arabian Sea. And in order to monopolize the trade, they used excessive violence. And because of this excessive violence, what we see that the trade of South India halted for some time. But after 1550, there was a change in the policy. They understood that this amount of violence will not work. Now, what they did now was a very different thing. They started using license, they started giving license. So it was another kind of a way of exploitation, and this license finally led to colonization. So if we have to conclude, we can say that before the advent of the Mughals, the scenario was already set. You had urban centers with very skilled labor, skilled artisan, cheap labor. You had immense buildings, you had transport, road, good connectivity that is always needed for good commercial activity, and you also have a population which was able to accept the empire building process. So one can say that Delhi Sultanate actually gave the impetus to what the Mughals started later on. So it actually was the precursor to the modern economic era of India.